Why don't we go ahead and kick off? Thank you all for joining. Sure appreciate it. This is a DevOps Community of Practice special event. Again, just thank you so much for coming on and being a part of this. This meeting is a recording, just a reminder for everyone. This is great. It allows us to share the content with colleagues in the near future as soon as it's posted, and we'll put in the Slack channel and listserv once that's available. Oftentimes folks have challenges with the calendar, so they can't always make our events, but the content is always available afterward. We're using Zoom. Just if there's any issues with the Zoom bombing or whatever, if there's any bad actors, just let us know, and we'll deal with it in a moment. And if it's pronounced or a real big issue, we'll just go ahead and call it off, record it separately, and share it out. So that's our plan B if things go poorly. We haven't run into that, but it's always good to talk about worst case scenario. Anyway, upcoming presentations. On the 25th of August, we'll have Noah presenting from the Office of Coastal Management on what they're up to related to DevOps. But then just overall, just a reminder what we're about. We're all about sharing what's happening with DevOps across government. That can be technical and management lessons learned, and also including the successes and anything y'all have learned as far as your journey. Cloud migration, application of agile methods, and moving towards that DevOps space. As far as this venue goes, go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I'll be using that after the presentation to facilitate the Q&A. And speaking of the presentation, I think the calendar note, a lot of the news that we sent out was about a half-hour event today. We're actually planning, or Andrew has planned to share, so we'll spread out to about an hour. Andrew will be talking for about 35, 40, 45 minutes, after which we'll do a Q&A. If you can't hang that long, that's cool. The event will be recorded. You can pick up on the remainder of it, but Q&A, put the questions in the chat, and I'll MC it at the end. Again, the video will be posted after the event, and then we'll share some additional info as far as our web presence. But do not forget that we have Slack and the listserv, so keep the conversation going. And the last advertisement is just a request for presentations. If y'all have anything to share, let me know. We'll tee you up for a future event, but we are planned through May of 2021 right now. Lots of folks are willing to share, which is great. But today, without any further ado, we have Andrew Clay Shafer, who is coming in to talk about the continuous DevOps dilemma. So Andrew, thank you so much. Thought leader in the space. So wonderful having you here today to just philosophize a bit and share what's on your mind. So without any further ado, over to you, sir.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian. This is I remember we were planning to do this virtual even in the first place. So the world changed to accommodate the virtual events. Although I do miss leaving the house from time to time. So I'll go through. There's tons of me talking, with my face or whatever about DevOps over the internet. If you search for DevOps and Andrew Shafer, you'll probably find a few videos. This is new stuff, and in some ways it's a retcon. And I was explaining to Brian what that means in an earlier conversation, that in the comics, when they kind of re-explain the history of a character, and I like some of the ideas I'm going to share today as a way to kind of explain more about the DevOps conversations that we had for the last decade. So I like to have definitions, and one of the things that's kind of funny in the DevOps conversation in the community is this idea of well, we just need a better definition. Somehow we get, like, if we just had better words, like somehow DevOps would get easier, which I think is nonsensical, but people like to argue over words. But for the sake of conversation, it's always nice to at least baseline what you're going to talk about with the person you're talking, so you can try to minimize the amount you're going to talk past each other. And there's a few themes with language that's weaved into this presentation. So a definition of a dilemma, one definition I found is a difficult or persistent problem. I think that if you've been trying to do this kind of work, whether you're talking about DevOps or Agile or whatever the new buzzwordy stuff that comes next, SRE, that you'll recognize that these are difficult and persistent problems. And then there's also this notion of a choice. So it's a problem involving a difficult choice. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Hopefully that'll be not necessarily clear in what you should do by the end, but maybe you can ask better questions about what your choices are. So what is DevOps? There's a bunch of conversations and a bunch of recordings of me and other people giving our definitions, but my sort of pithy, condensed version of DevOps is optimizing the human experience and performance, operating software and with humans. So I think that you recognize there's a technical side and a social side, and this whole thing is one socio-technical system. And if you just optimize for the tech without recognizing the humans as first-class actors, then you don't get good results. And I really believe everyone wants this. And this is actually sort of a joke, but it's true. And the reason it's a joke is they don't actually want this. Partially because they don't agree on what it means all the time. But here's what people actually want. Here's what I believe most of you want, actually. You want scalability, availability, reliability, operability, usability, observability, all for free. And then the most important, without changing anything. And this is just to make this one, more clear. I'm going to make it really, really big. This is what people want. They want all this benefit, but they don't want to change anything. Okay, that's hard. So you see this problem, this dilemma. So in this adventure, in the travels, and I've been very fortunate, as I said, and this is a question, many different phrasings, but what should we do, right? I get asked this a lot. And the simple answer is change, right? No one wants to change, but if you want things to be better, you got to change. And then usually there's some version of it depends. So when people say, what should we do? Well, what can you do? And why do you even do anything? So here's a question. I don't know if anyone plays this game. Some of you might have seen it before. What is the best move? What should you do? Right? This is a game, has rules, so there's only certain things you can do. But even if you are a quote unquote master, then it's not straightforward what the best move is in this context. So you have a bunch of choices. Some of them are terrible, but the best move, depending on usually E4 or D4 is the best kind of master-driven move. But that's not what all the grandmasters play in their opening against each other when they play at the highest level. So there's no best move, right? There's like a bunch of context here that you're going to create with the other player, and so the best move is undefined. Also, the question is really, there's another layer to it. So there's this game, it has rules, they're easy to understand, but how you want to play the game is about your personality, about your context, about your own situation, right? How do you want to play this game? You can play ways that are opening, the first move that you make changes all the rest of the moves you can make, it changes all the rest of the choices you get to make, and you sort of determine, especially in the first few moves, maybe 10 moves at the most, what the style of this game will be. Is it going to be an aggressive game? Is it going to be a closed game? Is it going to be something that's straight from the book until the end, or are you going to try some new creative things? And I don't know if anyone's following chess, but the way that AI has influenced chess, even in the last few years, it's changing the understanding that the humans have of this game, really just in the last few years with the Alpha Zero. So it's pretty fun. So this is a different scenario. So some of you played this game before. What's the best move here? This has a very specific move. In most cases, this position's very complicated, and almost every move the white will make will lose. There's moves that white can make that will get back to an advantage, But if you don't make the move, the right move, the first move, then this game is over and white will lose. Essentially, you have to stop. So if the black queen next move, if you haven't moved your king and the black queen moves to D1, then it's checkmate. So you have to deal with that. And you're probably going to lose material. And then what can you do to get out of it? So there's a specific move you have to make, which is you have to move the king to F1. So if you have this much context and you're this far, then we can look at the game and say, okay, this is the move. This is the one move you should make. So you have to understand what situation you're facing, what game you're playing. If you want to be successful, you have to base your moves and plans on the specific imbalance-oriented criteria that exists in the given position, not on your mood, tastes, and or fears. So this is from a book that I'm reading. If I understood all of it, I'd be way better at chess. But I'm fascinated with the dynamics of performance and learning. And one of the things I am investing in myself is I'm learning to play chess with my children are starting to play competitive chess, and it's pretty fun. The other thing that I'm focused on learning personally, especially now that we don't leave the house, is language. And so I stumbled into these like language learning polyglot communities have these conferences where they talk about all the ways that they acquire languages. And the current research suggests the average adult can learn to speak a new language fluently in 6 months. And there's all these people, or like there's kind of like this folk wisdom that you can learn languages better when you're young, and that seems to be untrue. The thing that you don't have when you're older is the time. The only thing that you really have a hard time acquiring when you're older, if you can invest the time, is the pronunciation and the hearing of the sounds that don't occur in your native language. But for learning the structure and the rest of it, you can actually do quite well. Most of us will not be learning a new language in the next 6 months, right? And the reason that we won't is because we didn't create these conditions. So if you create certain conditions, if you do certain things a certain way, you'll be able to speak a new language fluently within 6 months. And if you really are focused on it, you can get to native level in 2 years in the hardest languages in the world. So we don't create these preconditions for ourselves that allow us to do this. And one of the biggest preconditions is the necessity, right? So if you look at the evolution of language and the acquisition of language in children, you essentially stop learning language at the point where the language that you have meets your needs, right? So as you evolve and you want to make new friends, or you want to get into a topic in school or whatever, you acquire the language that you need to do the things that meet those needs. This is not the point of this talk, but I think there's also some like fascinating parallels with the way we acquire skills around programming languages. And you know, I would argue that like a lot of times people get all oh well, you know, you need to have this much experience, or you need to have this much time. And I think that's sort of a silly way to measure, especially when people in certain jobs, they kind of do the same thing over and over for 10 years. So it's not like you have 10 years of experience or like you're 10 years advanced. You basically did the same thing you did the first year for 10 years. That's not the same thing. So there's a whole nother thing. So being able to learn or having the ability to learn does not mean you will learn. And whoops. Being able to change does not mean you will change. What you have here, and this is a slightly different discipline or a slightly different domain. This is usually talked about in the context of sports or learning new skills or like adapting your physical body. But you put demands on the system, and the system adapts, right? The human body will adapt. The human brain will adapt, and the social technical system in your organization also adapts to the imposed demands. So learning is changing capabilities. And I brought this up a minute ago in a slightly different context, but if you get into the polyglot language community, they talk about, and they almost talk about it, it's like an admonishment, or they have a bit of disdain for what they call the timekeepers. And that's someone who will say, well, I studied French or I studied Japanese for 4 years in college, or you know, I had 4 years of German in junior high, but you don't have any skill you've like spent time, but you didn't acquire the skill. And it's proven, the research suggests that you could learn much more, much faster if you do things a certain way. But most people, because of tradition, because of a bunch of reasons, won't do those things that way. But then they'll say, oh, well, I spent this time. But the time doesn't matter. Only the capabilities matter to me. The other thing to keep in mind is, I ask questions about chess, but chess is not the only game, right? So there's lots of other games. So make sure that the game you're playing is the same. I think sometimes, again, this is another kind of like full presentation, but basically lots of the DevOps community, especially in the early conversations, they're literally startups who are trying to put cat pictures on the internet. Like the very, very first DevOps hashtag on Twitter, which I made, came from watching Flickr talking about how they put cat pictures on the internet. Now, that is a different game than trying to put systems on a jet fighter, or trying to put, there's all this stuff in the middle. So you think about the spectrum of what criticality is. On one far end of the spectrum, you have putting cat pictures on the internet. In the middle, you probably have people's money and livelihood or what have you. And then in the far end of the spectrum, you have life and death. And the games that you want to play, the rules of those games and what's appropriate from a process perspective, I will argue is contextually different. And you want to make sure you're playing the right game. So I'm going to talk about this 3 economies I did. And this is someone that I hired onto my team. This is related to his work. So first, I'm going to define economy. So an economy is a system of interaction and exchange. So a lot of times when people talk about economy, they mean like the stock market or maybe like a business context. But I'm going to argue that these economies I'm about to describe are present in your organization, even if you don't have the kind of normal business drivers and you're funded by legislation or whatever. Even in the government settings, these economies express themselves. And I hope that makes sense by the time I get done explaining it. So an economy is a system of interaction exchange, and it also essentially related to game. So it's kind of defining the legal moves that you can make inside of a game and the way that you get paid in that game. And I love game theory, and that's like a whole nother conversation. There's a bunch of me rambling about game theory recorded online, so you can watch it. So there's a bunch of these economies. You might not be at the highest level embedded in an economic game, but the economies that play out kind of in the social technical system that you're building, maybe I believe you have what I'm about to share with you, and you if you don't, then let's talk about it, but I believe you do. So this is actually related to Jay Bloom, who's on my team, his PhD work. So he gets all the academics, especially when he's still not finished with his PhD. I try to give credit to where credit is due and attribute him. So whenever I talk about 3 economies, I'll also mention Blade. Jay, so he's a Carnegie Mellon work on this stuff. So his research area is specifically focused on understanding how organizations or societies change their behavior to adopt technology. So he's working on a design PhD at Carnegie Mellon, specifically focused on this area. And so this is sort of an expression of some of that research and some of that work. So I promised you 2 economies or 3 economies, but I'm going to start with 2. So first economy that we're going to talk about, or we'll talk about them both because they're kind of in odds with each other, is the scale economy and the differentiation economy. And this is a graphic that Jay draws, and it doesn't necessarily make that much sense, but the idea here is that the scale economy on one end of the spectrum, differentiation on the other end of the spectrum, and they have slightly different rules. And I'm going to kind of walk through what those rules are and those payoffs. So these are 2 different games with different rules and payoffs. In the scale economy, your game is basically to reduce variability, reduce variation, right? So you're trying to govern things and reduce the variation so you can get efficiency. In the differentiation economy, you're trying to maximize the variation, right? So you can see you're already at odds between these 2 things. So just to simplify it, there's operational excellence and efficiency versus accelerated differentiation and the creation of value. Or even simpler, you're trying to essentially drive down costs. and you're trying to create more value. And this plays out in a lot of different ways. You could also have conversations about standards and security and a bunch of other stuff, compliance, regulation. But so far, I haven't really said anything about technology in the context of these economies. So maybe we should. And in particular, I see this kind of thing playing out in a lot of organizations where you have this divide and tension between some kind of central IT service provider function, and then all the different stakeholders or people who have a different mission who are trying to consume these things, and they're often at odds with each other. They're at odds with each other philosophically, and it really comes back to the fact that they're playing this different game. So this is a classic slide that I basically did over and over since 2008, I think. Before DevOps was a word, I always talked about this wall of confusion. When at the time I was calling it agile infrastructure and trying to build this notion of how developers and operators could work together. And what I would, there's a much longer version and build of how the wall comes and people don't even see each other as human, and they only communicate through ticket systems. But in the kind of retcon version of this, I think that this wall of confusion is literally that these two roles, the dev and the ops, are playing these two different games. So the developers are living and they're trying to win in the differentiation economy, and the operators are trying to win in the scale economy. So you don't understand the other game, and you don't understand how they're connecting, right? So everyone optimizes for their locally rational reality. It's like, oh, I'm on this side of it. I'm trying to win this game. No other game exists. They don't understand that they're consuming or they're dependent on each other to be successful. And then this is just a representation of what I'll call some kind of like DevOps anti-patterns. So in some cases, people think that the way to solve the wall of confusion is to create a new silo. We're going to solve our silo problem with a new problem, and now you have two walls. So you had a DevOps team in the middle. I don't necessarily, I think it can be an improvement, but I don't think it's necessarily optimal. And we'll get to what I think that means. And then the other thing that's in some ways actually worse is this interpretation of DevOps that just means that there's no roles anymore. There's no differentiation. There's no specialization, and everyone should do everything. And I think that's actually even worse. So what is this third economy? And I'm going to give you some examples by the end. But the scope economy is between the scale and the differentiation economy as a way to connect them. And it acts sort of as a clutch, transferring efficiency from the scale economy to enable the differentiation economy. Right? And this is only words, but hopefully by the end, you'll have kind of like a better vision of some examples. So how does this scope economy emerge? How do you get to a scope economy? Well, there's this notion of the change in time of different components, and I probably I wish I put the Wardley thing in right before this, but basically you have a process where things that start as differentiated as innovations might be better managed as a shared platform in the scope economy. And then the other thing is that you have things that would be more valuable in this platform as a shared resource that are being over-constrained and managed in the scale economy. Right? So the optimal thing is you're getting the maximum efficiency, or you're dialing in your efficiency based on the game you're trying to win to enable the differentiation. And the process of doing that is what we call recombining. And that is essentially bringing together two sides in a binary relationship. This is another Carnegie Mellon PhD. So his work is not on necessarily tech, but he still uses the word platforms about managing resources. And so the act of recombining is getting two sides to understand that their selfish interests on each side are best served by resolving the collective interests in a way that serves both of them. Right? And so to me, the key for quote unquote DevOps to really be magic, and I would say, going back to the very beginning, first puppet project, chef projects, every project I was ever involved in, there's always this goal, this aspirational goal to be able to give developers self-service access to build all these stacks and infrastructure in a way that enable them. A lot of times you didn't get there, and if you don't do the recombining step, so on one side you have a lot of projects where people imagine what a platform should be like from that sort of central IT thing, IT side, and they create this thing, and then the developers don't use it, right? Because they never went through the process of revealing what the other side needed to each other, so that you could emerge with the right solution. So the scope economy frames a negotiation between the selfish and collective interests. So the rules of the game: Scale's trying to win an efficiency game, differentiation's trying to win a novelty game, and the scope economy wins. You win this game when more people reuse these platform services, right? You get more connection from the efficiency to the novelty as those platforms get adopted. So in the perfect world, you have this three technologies economies connected together, where on the differentiation side, you're creating value. In the middle, you're enabling self-service with these constraints that keep promises to the scale economy that's providing, this reliable compute networking and storage. Now also, just because I like to be a philosopher, this is the Tao Te Ching, but this is not real. So if you actually think about this and think about how this all evolved over the last few years, right? Like the DevOps conversation that we're having today, and especially when you think about the tools and the way we can work together, is very different than the one we were having 10 years ago. Like, it's not fundamentally different in the sense that there's still this dilemma and this tension between the two economies, but it's different in a lot of other ways. And so if you think about this evolution, what you recognize is that there is innovation in the scale economy, right? That's like all, and there's also standardization in the differentiation economy that kind of enables all this stuff to hold together. And this is Simon Wardley. This is another person. I should put his name in here, but you basically have this notion of the S-curve of commodification, where the ideas start as an innovation, right? So the genesis, and then you get these custom built and then productized, and then later commodity. So a lot of what we're talking about today with the cloud computing conversation is really about the commodification of things that used to be products, right? Or initially were innovations. And this will continue for everything. So lots of things that we take advantage of today as a kind of custom built thing will eventually become features of these products and platforms that we're using. So I told you I'd give you some examples. So here's some examples. So this is, I'll just read this. Remove friction from product development. High trust, low process, no handoff between teams. Don't do undifferentiated heavy lifting. Use simple patterns automated by tooling. Self-service cloud makes impossible things instant. This is not my presentation. This is actually stolen word for word from another presentation that was given a long time ago called Netflix Lessons Learned, and it was given by Adrian Cocroft. He's right now at Amazon, but he essentially is describing this internal scope economy platform construct that Netflix built to enable the developers to move fast, but also keep promises to the operation. So you have these simple patterns automated by tooling. And I'm going to argue, and I had a very fortunate advantage to kind of watch a lot of this stuff be built over the last 15 years. But I think every single one of these cloud native companies built this platform internally because they had to, right? They had a process, and they had the pressure, the Darwinian pressure. They adapted to the demand on the system to build these things at scale. I didn't make this point as explicit in this presentation, but I often say DevOps is not a thing someone sat down and decided to do. It was an evolution of practice based on the Darwinian pressure to deliver faster at ever greater scale. So they build these platforms. This is straight from the SRE book. I'll read it. SRE build framework modules to implement canonical solutions for the concerned production area. As a result, development teams can focus on the business logic because the framework already takes care of correct infrastructure use. If you go read the SRE book, and particularly some of the sections, it's really describing this narrative of calming the Google platform, the architecting of this platform that allows them to do these things at this scale while enabling developers to do self-service things. So this Borg, if you know what Borg is, it's basically the container scheduler. That inspired Kubernetes. Borg is a scope economy construct that emerged inside Google. Kubernetes is a scope economy construct. And then Kubernetes right now is building a commons to build a commons, right? So there's this open source ecosystem. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Anyway, I should turn that off, but it's everyone else is connected to it. Sorry, I'll stay ring for a second.
Yeah, no worries, Andrew.
We'll edit and post. Someone picked it up. So Kubernetes is building a commons to build a commons, which I think is cool. It's just like when you reframe it through the economy. So we can improve our game by watching the best players. So I gave you some examples of what I think kind of these like platform emerging inside of these organizations look like. We can also learn from patterns for failure. And I've been involved in a lot of digital transformation investments, and some of them were successful, but a lot of them were disappointing to me, especially with the vision and kind of like hope I have for how the outcomes will come. So this is kind of in the middle. 70% of digital transformation fails is from this particular analyst. I've seen as high as 90, and I've seen as low as 60. So the best case from analysts is that 60% of these kind of investments will be failures. So to change is hard. So, and fail, there's another sort of definition game we could play what that actually means, but you didn't achieve some goal that you set out to achieve. So this is my kind of version of what I feel the failures were due to over the last thing. And it's sort of an expansion of the dev and ops to like some of these other capabilities or thinking about it. So there's failures where you have leadership that's not prepared for new ways of working. They might pay lip service. They might have read something about cloud or DevOps and a thing, but they're not really prepared. There's no executive sponsorship to change the way people work. Another thing that I see as a failure over and over is there's a missing kind of product capability to think about what you're actually building instead of just having a project. It's particularly dangerous when you have these long 2-3 year project plans to deliver something and there's no validation or hypothesis that's being tested, and you build these things and deliver these things and they have little or no impact, and that's what makes Andrew sad. So don't do that. So build things that matter. And then you have this other problem that I've seen as a failure where you have something that's defined that would matter, but for whatever reason, some combination of gaps in your technology skill set or your communication, that you aren't able to build things, the machinery that would deliver those requirements is just not there, and you don't get something out the other end. Then an architectural failure is you've built something that matters and people actually want to use it. It just wasn't built to accommodate the scale and the flexibility of the demands that all those people who want to use it put on it. And then last but not least, and related to that, is operational excellence. And if you don't have that, you're kind of in the new world, in the service-oriented world we live in, and we sort of are starting to take for granted. If you don't have operational excellence, then there's all sorts of problems with incidents, outages, and this isn't the point of this talk today, but there's lots of conversations and talks with me arguing that operations is the competitive advantage of the cloud natives. Like the operational excellence is what gives these advantages. So let's reframe these failures as opportunities and think about what would it take to build them out the other way. So leadership that's sponsoring actual change, executive change or executive sponsorship for change, having some understanding of framework for building things that matter, right? If you have the perfect dev and ops pipeline and all that solved, but you still don't have that connected to something meaningful for your organization, you're not going to get great results. Even if you have the, all the problems solved between dev and ops. Development, deliver the features. I think this is the kind of like the sweet spot that gets the most attention. This sort of the agile practices. Architecture, I think, is underappreciated, particularly by the agile community. But there's an emergence by necessity if you build these systems at scale to understand system architecture. if you want to be able to keep promises about scale and latency and failure and the rest of these things. And then last but not least, operational excellence. So this is like a framing of all these things. And then just because of this audience, and also, you know, I spend a lot of time talking to people who have these other kind of considerations and needs around governance, risk, and compliance. So what about security and a bunch of other stuff? Well, to me, security is not really a competence, right? To me, security is a state of the system. It's a quality of the system. And you're going to get better system security by thinking about this as a requirement of the product and driving the security through the development, architecture, and operations competencies. This is really what you've seen emerge in the cloud natives. And the idea that you can add security later after the fact as like a separate, separate competency that kind of comes in, it forces a lot of rework, and it's never good. It's never as good as it could be if it was built in from the beginning. And as a result, you see lots of what I consider theatrics and gatekeeping that aren't helping, they're actually hindering security. So you're much better off if you can get to the point where you can consistently repave everything to a known state with this automation. The current kind of state of the art practices are proving that this type of security is actually better in being able to respond to an incident than the old gatekeepery, like theatrical security that I'm certain some of you have experienced. So there's all these other illities as well. So usability, changeability, observability, scalability, reliability, operability, security. Those to me are kind of like qualities of the system that should be driven through this kind of competence model. And I also want to make clear in my mental model of this, and this also goes back to the DevOps conversation, these are not really roles in the way that I think about it, right? So they're capabilities. And the reason I like framing it this way is that way you can think about the capabilities of an organization independent of its org chart, independent of its structure. And I'd also argue that many organizations have these roles by title, but they don't have these capabilities, right? So lots of kind of theatrics around the industry or the organizations that have like quote unquote a product owner, quote unquote operations, but they don't necessarily have these high levels of competence with those capabilities. And then this is just like a thought leadery way to like meditate on this stuff. So strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Famous Sun Tzu thing. So this is kind of putting these things in a framing where you have the differentiation economy and the scale economy, and then the tactical and the strategic. And so here this framing is development is essentially tactical differentiation. Operations is tactical scale, in the framing of the economies. Product is strategic differentiation. Architecture is strategic scale. And that's just a way to meditate on a bunch of things. So coming to the end, we have this kind of notion of the platform as an interface that's emerged from some of these conversations around platforms, getting rid of the wall confusion, using this as a recombining exercise to build up these things that serve both sides of this dilemma, that you can give a little bit to get a lot more by resolving your selfish interests on either side of this in the collective interest through this recombining process, bringing together dev and ops to build the platform that allows them to keep each other's promises. So coming to the end, change your process, but don't abdicate the outcome to a process. I think there's often a tendency to have this like magical thinking that we'll implement this thing, there's nothing safe about software, and then they'll be like, they'll wonder why they didn't get good results because they didn't really change that much. So recognize that we are agents, we are actors, and we co-create the system that we participate in. So we can change this as individuals, but also you need the sponsorship. So this is, I think, after 10 years of thinking about and talking about DevOps, DevOps is simple, but it's not easy. And it's hard because no one can make the change unilaterally. Like you can't just do DevOps all of a sudden by yourself. You kind of need this process to bring people together. So learn to speak each other's languages. It shouldn't take more than 6 months if you really need to. So this is the end, parting thoughts. This is stealing from Senge, but I really like this, this systems thinking iceberg. And what Senge is arguing is that we can only see events. And then those events, we can kind of see the behaviors a bit. So the events are what we see. There's patterns of behavior that create those events. There's some systemic structure that supports the patterns of behavior. And then the whole thing is underlined by these models. And what Senge talks about is like the true change, the true transformation has to start at the bottom. And if you don't change the mental models, then you can't really change anything else. So the change starts with our mental models, then the system structure, and finally the patterns of behavior. Thought precedes action as lightning does thunder. I like poets. This is interesting in its own right, but it's Nobel Prize winning research from the 70s that shows individuals working within a bureaucratic organization where supervisors have instituted a rigid set of rules leads to tighter rules and more data produced about the conformance of the rules, which leads to data about the lack of conformance, which leads to like this downward spiral of things getting worse and worse from the 70s. And like we have to like reinvent DevOps, you know, in 10 years ago or whatever. So trying to change behaviors without changing the system never works. Doesn't work. You can't solve social problems with tech, but you can solve tech problems with sociology. So think new thoughts, build better systems together. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much. This is, wow, you covered a lot. You got into Taoism. Economists have talked.
That was the weakest intro to Taoism anyone's ever did.
Well, but also effective management of the commons, which economists have argued and studied for a long time. So
that's actually what Ostrom's research that got a Nobel Prize was about. She did a lot of work on this notion of commons, and so I was introduced to her by Demeje, who I mentioned, who's this CMU PhD.
Cool.
That's he's like his whole thing is about this notion of like creating commons and recommoning, independent of tech or any of this like platformy stuff.
I'm going to go to the questions in the chat. So I'll start emceeing here. Folks, feel free to drop them in. We got about 15 minutes to the top of the hour. I've got some questions too, but just, yeah, Andrew, overall, thank you. First one's from Ed from the Department of Labor. Where have you seen the transition from the first two economies to the third, especially in government? How would you get a group ready to increase the chance it would work? Thanks so much.
So there's actually a pretty good example in Fed, I think, which is the deployment. It's a Kubernetes deployment at USCIS that was originally kind of enabled by Mark Schwartz, who left, breaking all the rules, right? So there's lots of, and I maybe I didn't make it really that clear in the sense you don't, like, the scope economy doesn't make the other two economies go away. So you don't move into the scope economy and the others go away. You still have to play those games to win them. The scope economy allows you to win both of them simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's always, I think there's a tendency in lots of this stuff to kind of over celebrate small victories, but at the same time, like, you don't want to always be negative about everything that's happened. And I know there's a lot of constraints in government, especially when you start thinking through the fact that a lot of the things are set up so that they're not, you're not even part of the same organization, right? This is hard enough when everyone's part of the same company. When you have third-party contractors for every capability, it gets even more complicated. But I think if you look at the USCIS stuff and what they're doing with Kubernetes and what they took to get there, I think that's a pretty good representation of this journey in the federal space. Excellent.
Next one's from Graham at Census. For IT managers who've read The Fifth Discipline, what other books would you recommend reading to be a better DevOps seeker of awesome?
I mean, there's so many good books, and they're all over the place. You know, that one of my, what I think is the best DevOps books is this Team of Teams book from General McChrystal, talking about the Joint Task Force, and they essentially go through this recommening exercise once they recognize that they can't respond in these urban environments against an adversary that's highly networked and you know, changing things in real time. So the story starts with all these different kind of military silos, and they all have their information and they all have their different abilities, but they can't coordinate or react fast enough to adapt to the situation. And so through this story of Team of Teams, you see more and more of the decision making being pushed to the edge to enable action, direct action to be taken at the point of contact, and then more and more recommenting and sharing of this data in a central way to coordinate between the different capabilities. So I think that's an excellent book. I'll come up with a book recommendation list. There's a bunch of them depending on what you're into. I think there's some that are purely like this philosophical framing, and then there's some there's like learn the technical best practices, right? How are you thinking about observability? How are you thinking about, you know, build pipelines, trusted software supply chain? You know, what kind of promises can you keep with your tech? So it's a mix of both. You asked for manager stuff, but I'll make a book list and give it to Brian.
Yeah, and I'll kick that out on the Slack and listserv. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. If you found yourself in a role as a federal IT manager, what kind of bureaucracy hacking would you attempt?
I'd probably get fired.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think I personally feel like a lot of conversations I have in the Fed space is basically people lay out this stuff where it's like, how would you solve this thing that's impossible to solve? And I think for me, you know, going back to this example of Mark Schwartz and some of the stuff that I have seen, you got to figure out where your boundaries are, where you're enabled, who's going to support you, and one of the things I got advice from my own career, and there's a few versions of this, and it's hard to even know who to attribute it to, but it's basically change your organization or change your organization. And that means that you do everything you can to try to drive outcomes at the level that you're empowered with the groups you're working in and for. And at the point where they're not going to change or you're exhausted, that there might be other opportunities in other organizations that would be able to take more advantage of your interests and capability. So find a balance between trying to save the world in the you know, corner you're painted into versus finding a new corner to kind of paint a new picture, I think is the question you have to answer for yourself.
Next question. As the number of economies increase, especially in government with separate groups like testing, security, ops, acceptance policy, et cetera, is there a decreasing likelihood of achieving the benefits of something like DevOps?
So I wouldn't use the language that way. I don't consider them different economies, right? Like they're different games. They're trying to optimize for different things. So maybe it's fair to use them that way. But in the framing of the three economies, I would argue that they're still kind of living in one or the other. Although maybe there's like this multiplexing in terms of how they need to share resources. I think that the answer is it's definitely complicated, but it's also not. Like we make it harder than it has to be because we're all solving our locally rational game instead of understanding the big picture. So if you have a leader or you are the leader that can bring those groups together and get that common vision, get that shared language around what they're trying to accomplish, like no developer in their right mind thinks that we should build something that's insecure. They just don't know better. Right. And so the game to be played, in my opinion, that is quote unquote DevOps is about building the right feedback loops between all of these interested parties so that there's enough kind of visibility and shared context that you can make good decisions. And then the second thing is do everything we can, and this is like the recommenting platform solution, everything we can to make the right thing the easy thing, right? If the right thing is hard, then the chance people are going to do it is lower. So you go out of your way to try to make the right thing the easy thing. That's how you can enable the self-service and the differentiation, and unlocks the differentiation economy. If the right thing is hard, then you have to go back to tons of like checks and compliance and the rest of it, where like the state of the art right now is trusted software supply chain keeps all these promises for you, and you're able to unlock the developers by letting everyone recommend their interests. So there's pre-blessed security modules that any developer can use. If you want to use something that's out of that, go back to the old ritual and theatrics around getting the new thing approved.
Next, thank you. Yeah. Next question's from Graham over at Census. Are you aware of any Pareto inefficient Nash equilibrium opportunities in the Fed government?
So this is a shout out to a talk I gave in 2013. And if people don't know the game theory and the economics of this, basically a Pareto inefficient Nash equilibrium is my kind of silly way, mathematical way to say that you have something. Pareto inefficiency by definition means that there's something that could be improved and nothing would be worse. So no player in the game would be worse. So there's this definition of that, but then a Nash equilibrium is what makes it hard. So a Nash equilibrium means that no one will change their strategy. No one will unilaterally. This is another Nobel Prize. So Nash, this is the Beautiful Mind movie. Nash got a Nobel Prize for his work by showing that in certain games with certain payoffs, then you get these equilibriums where no player will change their strategy. Now, the only way to get out of a Nash equilibrium is to literally change the game, change the rules of the game, change the payoffs of the game. So I think in short, every problem in government is essentially a Pareto inefficient Nash equilibrium. There's no shortage of Pareto inefficient Nash equilibriums. What there's a shortage of is that kind of leadership that's got a new mental model about how to improve it, that's both quote unquote empowered enough and visionary enough to move in a better direction.
Question I have, just making sure I'm unmuted, related to that, you brought up learning, skill development, and really the focus on capabilities as opposed to time, and talk quite a bit from a kind of an individual standpoint. What's your thoughts as far as getting the organization from being kind of traditional or legacy to the moving into the realm of embracing uncertainty and be constantly learning, figuring out practices, experimenting, and adopting all aspects of that economy?
So the same talk that I gave that has the Pareto inefficient Nash equilibrium reference from 2013 has this thing called the dimensions of organizational learning. And the dimension of organizational learning, it's research from the 90s that I found fascinating, and I still do. And it's one of my saddest things about DevOps is more people don't understand it. But if you go look up the 7 dimensions, or it's called the DLOC, the dimensions of learning organization questionnaire, and then you read through those questions, and it basically asks you questions like, in my organization, such and such, and you rate it from 1 to 10, right? So like my actual advice is read the questionnaire from the dimensions of organizational learning, and then try to invert them and make them statements, right? So it'll be things like, in my organization, people are encouraged to participate regardless of their rank. In my organization, we spend time thinking about how to do the work better, right? And there's a bunch of these things, and there's a big version that's like 42 questions, and there's a short one that's like 20 or something. And we can dig those up and share them in links or whatever. But basically, each of those kind of gives you this prescriptive way to invert it and say, okay, can we encourage more participation? Can we focus on the meta learning, right? So there's the doing the task, and I didn't put this in this presentation, but sometimes I put a funny quote that it's like, I don't have time to learn new things because I'm too busy getting things done. And then I attribute that. I think this is in the one you invited me to speak this, I put this quote. And then
Yep.
it's like the attribution is the least productive person in the world, right?
Yep.
Because if you're too busy getting things done to learn new ways to do things, you're kind of trapped in a certain place. And not to name any names, but sometimes you can go into an organization and you can kind of see the year that organization stopped learning, right? From the tech and the processes that they have in place, and there's a bunch of reasons and contracts or whatever that kind of keep it that way. But it's like, we're in 2020, anyone can come to 2020. Like, there's lots of cool stuff that you can use.
Yeah, it is interesting. It takes, I think, quite a bit of bravery to do that. And I think organizations that are lean tend to have more structure for that. That concept of Kaizen and Kaizen teams.
I think what you just said is the key, right? So there's not a shortage of information. There's a shortage of courage. There's a shortage of, like, everyone has this. It's just because of the, whether you want to call it a Nash equilibrium or a dilemma or whatever, like, people are sort of trapped in this strategy and they need something to shock them out of it for a variety of reasons. And I think it gets even harder in some of the government settings, because in a bigger economy game, like, if you don't make money, you're done. When your budgets are kind of legislated, then I don't think you always have the same kind of Darwinian pressure, but there's still a huge opportunity. And I've been inspired by some of the things I've seen in some of the agencies, particularly where they do have some pressing need, quote unquote, clear and present danger, if you will, to do things in a different way. And because they have that necessity, because they have that need, they change their behavior rather quickly. They get their capabilities much faster. So if you don't see the change, it's often because you don't have the necessity. There's no pressing necessity.
Right. Isn't that interesting? And it can be money, as you described, or it could be other necessities, right? So
Absolutely.
There's opportunities in government. Yeah. Andrew, thank you so much.
I live here and I pay taxes, so I want the best thing for
Exactly. And that's what's exciting about pushing this in government. I think many of us have that same perspective, especially the folks that were listening to you today. So thank you so much for presenting, sharing your thoughts, and being a part of the Q&A at the end. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
To engaging with you at any point in the future.
Reach out on LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation. I do drop in sometimes to these, like, interagency DevOps things, and there's a lot of other things that are interesting and fun to talk about. If you see any of my talks online and want to talk about those, hit me up on LinkedIn.
Right on. And for the community, folks on the phone or on Zoom here, again, we've got another session on the 25th of August. Noah's going to be sharing what they're pushing over at Coastal Management. And this video will be available here in the next week or so for everybody to share out with colleagues. So, Andrew, thank you again. You have a wonderful day. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.